This week, we take up the topic of the Cadential 6/4. It's one of the most challenging topics we'll cover all term. But there's no need to be scared. Let's begin by revisiting an example we looked at already from last week. Alright, enough of that spooky music. Let's turn back to this art song by Louise Reichardt. We were analyzing the passage at the end of this excerpt, measures 7 and 8, and we talked about the bass line 3, 4, 5, 1. And we mentioned that the arrival on scale degree 5 on the bass usually represents the arrival of the dominant harmony. Last week we skipped the chord on beat 3 and went directly to the chord on beat 4. But now it's time for us to revisit that chord on beat 3. Let's listen to the passage once more to get it in your ear, and then we'll talk a little bit about the analysis.
Durch die bunten Rosenhecken flattern Schmetterlinge hin, bunte Lerchentöne wecken schon die Tageskönigin. Immer wahr.
We have a little bit of a paradox here. If we isolate just beat 3 of bar 7, we have what looks like a tonic chord, F, A flat, C, in second inversion. So is the correct label 1, 6, 4? On the other hand, this bar goes from tonic to subdominant to beat 3. Beat 3 represents the arrival of scale degree 5 on the bass. We learned last week when scale degree 4 goes to scale degree 5 in the bass, that often represents subdominant going to dominant. So is this a dominant chord or a tonic chord? Let's try to understand the Reichardt passage by comparing it to this simplified version that you see on the right side of the screen. We'll do it in 2 stages. Here's the first stage. So we have tonic moving to subdominant, and then we have a dominant chord lasting for 2 beats. You hear the bass dropping down an octave. That represents a single harmony lasting for 2 beats, and then we resolve to tonic. Now let's compare that to a slightly more embellished version. This is almost the exact same chord progression. Tonic moves to subdominant, and then on beat 3 we arrive in the bass on what looks like the dominant note, but the chord above it is a little bit tricky to talk about. We'll come back to that in a second. Beat 4 we have the dominant, and then tonic. So the question is, the status of this chord that we've added on beat 3, is it some kind of embellishment of a dominant harmony? Well, what if we think of the F and the A flat as embellishing tones? The F in the tenor would be essentially a suspension, tied over from the previous chord, and then moving down by step to E natural. The A flat in the alto would be an accented passing tone, the alto going B flat, A flat, G. If we think of those notes in the triangle as embellishments, that means the chord on the 3rd beat already is C, E natural, G. The embellishing tones just displace or postpone the genuine chord tones for 1 beat. In other words, when we arrive on beat 3, we have already arrived at a root position 5 chord. The F and the A flat should be considered to be embellishments. To put it another way, this is a cadential 6/4 chord. That represents a dominant harmony in root position at a cadence, but instead of getting 5 in root position right away, we have this embellishing motion that goes from 6/4 to 5/3. What I mean by that is the notes that are a 1/6 and a 1/4 above the bass are embellishing tones. The notes that are a 1/5 and a 1/3 above the bass, Those are chord tones. Those are part of the root position dominant harmony. In this example, the dominant lasts for 2 beats. And that's essentially the same situation we have in bar 7. We have 1/6 goes to 4, and then on beats 3 and 4 we have dominant harmony. Those 2 beats together collectively make up a root position dominant chord. But to be more specific, on beat 3 we have 6/4, that is to say, cadential 6/4, that resolves on the 4th beat to 5/7, the root position dominant 7th. In other words, on beat 3, the F and the A flat are not truly chord tones. They're embellishing tones, and they resolve down by step, E natural and G. You might be tempted when you see a cadential 6/4 chord to label it as 1/6/4. But since it functions as a dominant, as an embellishment of a root position dominant at a cadence, that's why it's called cadential 6/4. In this course, we will be labeling it 5 and writing 6/4 going to 5/3, or in this case, 6/4 going to 7. So a few important things to remember. Cadential 6/4 occurs at a cadence, over the dominant at a cadence. We have scale degree 5 in the bass. The 6/4 sonority falls on a strong metrical position. So in this case, beat 3 is a stronger beat than beat 4. On beat 3, we have the 6/4 sonority. And then as we go to beat 4, that 6/4 moves down to 5/3, or moves down to a 7th, and we expose the true harmony here, the root position dominant 7th chord. Now, if you're feeling a little skeptical of the idea that we're labeling a chord 5 when it seems to have the notes of a 1 chord, you're not alone. Many students, and even some professional theory teachers, have disagreements about this. You might even have been taught in a previous course to label this chord 1. But I'd like to explain a little bit more the logic for why we're going to be labeling it 5 in this course. And to help explain the idea, let's turn now to a movement by Franz Schubert. This is from his Little Piano Sonata in A major, and this is the slow movement in the key of D major. Let's listen to the passage, and here's a question I'd like you to think about. How many chords do we have in measure 1 of this piece? Is the first chord a B minor chord, or is the first chord a D major chord? The most literal way to look at the very first chord of this piece would be to say D, F sharp, and B must be a B minor chord in first inversion. But a more sophisticated way would be to notice that B, A is an appoggiatura. The B's are embellishing notes. Therefore, the harmony is D, F sharp, A. Same thing, in fact, 2 bars later in measure 3. C sharp, E, G, we have B, A once again. So instead of taking the B as a chord tone, let's think of the A as part of this chord. We have the same idea once again in bar 5, which is like the beginning, and take a look especially at bar 6. A, C sharp, and G, that seems like a dominant 7th chord. How does F sharp fit into that? Well, that F sharp must once again be another appoggiatura, another embellishing tone decorating the E. That makes sense to think of that chord as A, C sharp, E, G, and so on. Let's listen to the passage again and focus on all the notes in triangles as embellishing notes. how does that affect the way you'd think about the harmonic analysis? Remember, when we analyze a chord, we basically ignore the embellishing notes and focus on the notes that they resolve to, focus on the chord tones to identify the chord. If you agree with me that measure 1 of this piece is a tonic chord, a D major chord, that the B as an embellishing note should not factor into our interpretation of the harmony, then you should also agree with me that in a cadential 6/4, the 6th and the 4th above the bass are embellishing notes. Therefore, cadential 6/4s are best thought of as root position 5 triads, with a 6/4 embellishment that resolves down to 5/3. Just like the first harmony of this piece isn't a B minor chord, that B is a decoration. The A is the chord tone. So let's try some analysis of a passage that includes some cadential 6/4s. This is from Maria Teresa von Paradis. I've done a little bit of preliminary analysis by labeling the harmonic functions using a principle we learned last week, that when the bass goes 1, 4, 5, usually scale degree 1 in the bass is tonic, scale degree 4 in the bass is subdominant, and scale degree 5 in the bass is dominant. So I've sketched that in as a preliminary analysis. Let's listen to the passage, and then I'll encourage you to pause the video and think about the harmonies that express the functions that I've labeled in green. The more detailed analysis in blue seems to bear out our initial sketch of an analysis that we had in green. Namely, first measure is tonic, 1. Downbeat of the second measure, we have a pair of appoggiaturas, B flat and D. They resolve down by step to A and C. So I have C in the bass, A and C, and that seems to express a 2 diminished 6 chord, one of the subdominant harmonies that we learned about last week. Then on beats 2 and 3 of the same bar, I have 5, 5 in the bass. And above that D in the bass, I have a 6/4 moving down to 5/3. This is an example of cadential 6/4. We can think of the B flat in the melody basically as an accented passing tone. Same thing with the G. So the real harmony here is D, F sharp, A. That's on the last beat of the bar. The D, G, B flat, that's a pair of embellishing tones decorating the main harmony. Essentially the same thing repeats in bars 3 and 4. And then finally we land on a 1 chord for a perfect authentic cadence. Let's try another example, this one drawn from a keyboard sonata by Anna Bonn. I always like to start an analysis with the parts that are easy, and then circle back to the parts that are tricky. So first measure, that's pretty clearly 1. I haven't indicated that the bass skips from B flat up to D and back down to B flat. Let's just take B flat as the main bass note for the whole bar, so root position 1. Bar 2 looks tricky, we'll come back to that. Bar 3, that's a 5/7 chord. At the very end of the bar we see an E flat in the soprano, so that's why I'm calling it 5/7. And then the very end, that's also a little tricky, so I put a question mark. Let's listen to the passage again, and take a second to see if you can figure out the passages with the question marks. What's the Roman numeral? Which notes count as part of the chord, and which notes are embellishing notes? So one theme I've been emphasizing in this course is that the bass is often a clue to the harmony. The main bass note of bar 1 is tonic. The main bass note of bar 2 is dominant, F, F. The entirety of bar 2 we should think of as a dominant chord. The melody notes have a pair of suspensions, restruck suspensions, B flat D, move down by step to A, C. That is a cadential 6-4, where the 6 and 4, the embellishing tones, move down by step to 5-3. In the third bar, we have a 5-7 chord, and then the bass moves in the last bar to tonic. Once again, we have a pair of suspensions. We have a 9-8 suspension and a 4-3 suspension. So there's sort of a rhyme between what's going on in bars 1 and 2 and what's going on in bars 3 and 4. A few points I'd like to emphasize at this point. First of all, think of a cadential 6-4 as essentially a root position 5 chord. The 6-4 notes, the notes that are a 6th and a 4th above the bass, are embellishing notes. And it's the 5-3 that are the true chord tones. Secondly, something you've noticed in several examples so far is this octave leap in the bass. 5-5, that sort of thing. Very common between the cadential 6-4 and the 5-3, especially in Baroque and classical music. It's not something you have to make it a cadential 6-4, but when we do have it, that's a clue that the dominant is being embellished, that the dominant lasts for both of those beats. 5-5 is just a stylistic way for bass lines to show that this is 2 beats of an embellished root position 5. Let's try this passage from a keyboard sonata by Domenico Cimarosa. I've put in blanks here to show that we should be putting a new harmony for every quarter note beat. One clue. Let's pay close attention to the bass line. How is the bass line giving us a signal for where we should hear the different harmonic functions, and how can that help us to fill in the analysis? Well, we learned last week that bass lines of 3, 4, 5 often represent tonic, subdominant, dominant, help leading us toward a cadence. And we also have been seeing that bass lines of 5, 5 with a leap of an octave represent the dominant harmony embellished, often with a cadential 6-4. So that should be a clue to help us fill in the harmonies here. I'll encourage you to pause the video, think about the chords that belong in each blank. Notice that the melody has some stepwise or scalar motion, so some of those notes in the melody are embellishing notes that we'll have to ignore to think about our harmonic analysis. To help flesh out our analysis, it helps to recognize the pattern of embellishing tones in the melody, which is this. For every group of 4 16th notes, the third 16th note is an accented passing tone. All the other notes are part of the chord. 1-6 goes to 2-6, goes to, you guessed it, cadential 6-4, and then 5-3. So essentially we have A and C sharp as our 6-4 above the bass, moving down by step to G sharp and B. And essentially the same thing is repeated in the second measure of the excerpt, leading us to our perfect authentic cadence. We'll end today with an aria from Gluck's opera Orfée, the Orpheus myth. The aria you'll hear here, J'ai perdu mon Eurydice, is his song of lament after he loses his wife Eurydice. Let's listen to the passage, and let's focus, you guessed it, on the bass line. In particular, I'm looking for bass lines that go 3, 4, 5, or 3, 4, 5, 5, 1 as a marker of an impending cadence. When we hear 5, 5 in the bass, be on the lookout for cadential 6-4.
J'ai perdu mon Eurydice, rien n'a gagné mon malheur, sois cru,
Well, it's not surprising that the cadential progression comes toward the end of the excerpt. Twice in a row we have basically the same thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 1 in the bass. 1, 2, 3 in the bass, that's a tonic expansion. 4 in the bass, that's a subdominant. 5, 5, that's the dominant. Let's fill in some of the harmonies. We've already learned about 1, 7 diminished 6, 1 as a passing progression that expands tonic. Notice here the parallel tenths between the bass and the tenor E, G, F sharp, A. That's very typical when we have this chord progression. 2, 6 we've learned about as a subdominant harmony. And new this week we're focusing on cadential 6, 4. So if we take a look in bar 7 on beat 3, we have A in the bass for 2 beats. We don't have that octave leap A, since we only want to go so low in register, but we have 2 A's in a row. Above those A's I have 6, 4 going to 7, 5, 3, going to a root position 7th chord. So 6, 4 to 5, 3, but we've added a 7th. That's 6, 4 to 7 in shorthand. Those 2 beats represent the dominant harmony in root position, preparing for the cadence on the downbeat of bar 8, PAC. And then starting on the middle of bar 8, we essentially echo the same chord progression for a second PAC. That's the hardest part of this analysis, the part with the cadential 6-4. Now I'll invite you to pause the video and think about the harmonies in the rest of the passage. Here we filled in the rest of the harmonies. Essentially, the first 2 bars are a tonic expansion. We start with 1, and bar 2 ends on 1, 6. In bar 3, we move to 4, that's a subdominant. End of the bar is 5, 7. Downbeat of bar 4 is 1 for an imperfect authentic cadence. And we have something like a similar progression, expanding tonic from the end of bar 4, 1, 6. End of bar 5, we're still on 1, 6. Middle of bar 6, we're on 1, and we begin the cadential progression that we already analyzed. Let's listen to the entire passage. I encourage you to focus on the bass line and how the bass line gives us a clue when we're at a cadence, when we're hearing subdominant moving to dominant. And in particular, since it's the theme of this week's lesson, let's focus on the cadential 6-4 chords.
J'ai perdu mon Eurydice, rien n'égale mon malheur, soit cruel qu'elle rigueur, rien n'égale mon malheur, je sais combat ma douleur.
So that's about it for cadential 6-4 chords. A few things to remember to help you with your analysis. First of all, avoid labeling these as 1, 6, 4. Even though they have the same notes as a tonic triad, you may have had a previous teacher who asked you to label it as Roman numeral 1. And that's the easiest way to analyze these chords. But now we're aiming for a more sophisticated level of understanding of how these chords function in context. How do they function? Point number 2. Cadential 6-4 represents the dominant function. They represent a root position dominant chord, embellished with a 6th and a 4th above the bass. The 6th and the 4th, the 6-4 notes, are embellishing tones. They fall on a metrically strong position, so they could be suspensions, appoggiaturas, accented passing tones, some type of strong beat dissonance. And they move down by step to a 5 and a 3, 6 to 5, 4 to 3, or cadential 6-4 to 5-3 for a root position chord. Those 5-3 notes, they fall on a metrically weaker position. So you might see the 6-4 on beat 1 and the 5-3 on beat 2, for example. That's typically the way we see accented, metrically strong embellishing notes resolving. That's about it for Cadential 6-4. You'll get some practice with the analysis and the homework this week, and I wish you a very happy